Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel, and if you're new to my channel, hello, my name is Gabby and welcome. If you are new here, never watched any of my videos, have no idea what I do here on my channel, I cover true crime cases, and pretty much all of the cases that I cover are 20 years or older. So if that's something that you might be interested in, those vintage cases, then make sure to head down below and click that subscribe button, and also make sure to turn on the post notifications to be notified every time that I upload. So today we are diving into the third case that I'm going to be covering in my Oldies October series, which, you know, the title is pretty self-explanatory, but every October I do a series on my channel where I cover very old cases. Today we are talking about the case of Gabby's bones, which when I first came across this case, this is what this case is called. The title of this case is usually referred to as Gabby's bones, even though there is technically no Gabby in this case, but you'll get what I mean, you know, farther along in the video. When I first came across this case, I was like, Gabby, you know, like, that's me. I'm definitely not just covering this case because my name is included in the title of this case, but it's just a coincidence. This is a very interesting case. With all that being said, let's get right into it. The case of Gabby's bones, it was popularized and spread around a lot more because it was on the show Unsolved Mysteries. If you want to watch it, you can look it up on YouTube. I will have the episode down below in the description of this video, but according to Unsolved Mysteries, their YouTube channel, it is season 5, episode 20. But this case in the episode, it's really only covered in like 7 to 8 minutes, because back at the time when this episode aired, there was not a lot of information about this case out there. So it just took up a tiny bit of time at the end of the video. But if you do want to watch it and see some firsthand interviews with people involved in the case, I definitely recommend checking that out. But let's get into the story itself. This story takes place in Thermopolis, a small town in general, but the largest town in Hot Springs County, Wyoming. Its population has fluctuated a bit through the years, but in 1986, the year we're starting the story, the population was around 3,500, give or take. Like so many areas we've discussed before, it was an area used to the calm. It is a tourist hotspot due to its hot springs, but it was never familiar with violence. So when a murder mystery swept through the area in the early 90s, it took the town by surprise. If you've watched Unsolved Mysteries, you may know that to protect some people's identities in the show, they will give that individual a false name, aka a pseudonym. The name Gabby is actually no real person's name in this case. It was simply a name given to one of the main people involved by the creators of the show Unsolved Mysteries. As the story goes, though, according to Unsolved Mysteries, in the year 1986, a man named Gabby left some of his possessions with a good friend of his when he kind of left the area. This man named Gabby, his actual name was John David Morris. The friend he gave these possessions to was named Noel Sessions. One of these possessions was a shed, and inside the shed was an old footlocker. Noel had this footlocker for years, and he thought of opening it on the regular. It was locked though, and looked quite securely locked at that. 6 years later, during the year 1992, Noel decides it is finally time to open this footlocker and see what's inside. I mean, I'd be curious. The mystery had consumed him long enough. Like I stated before, it was securely locked. He had to use a blowtorch to cut through the lock. So he finally gets the trunk open, and what he discovers inside shocks him. It was a skeleton. The skeletal remains of a human that had been wrapped in plastic, a belt, and a very old grocery store bag from the store Hy-Vee. Noel told the Des Moines Register in 1992 that the skull was just sitting right on top when he opened the trunk. It obviously surprised him, but he and his wife had different reactions to this gruesome discovery. Noel immediately wanted to give the bones a proper burial, which of course sounds sweet and thoughtful and all, but his wife, I feel like she was kind of like all of us. She was basically like, honey, no, like, we need to notify the authorities about this. So the police were called, and the police started looking into it. They had never heard of anything like this before. And of course, the main individual that everyone wanted to get in contact with and speak to about this insane discovery, was the man who gave Noel the shed with the footlocker in it to begin with, John David Morris, aka the man referred to as Gabby in the Unsolved Mysteries segment. When John was asked about the footlocker by his friend Noel, and Noel told him what they found inside of it, John claimed that he never opened it before, that he didn't know what was inside of it, and that he always wanted to open it, but he never really put in the effort to do so, and that through the years he wanted to take a hacksaw and try and open it, but he never got around to it. And Noel, being the logical person, was like, okay, where did you buy this footlocker? Because we need to get to the bottom of this. And John told him that he thought he bought it at a garage sale some years back, but he wasn't quite sure when. Other than not knowing when he bought it, he said he also didn't know where he bought it. They determined that the bones had come from a man. Sheriff John Lumley was put on the case, a case that was now classified as a homicide case because after examining the man's bones, they found a bullet lodged in the skull. Now, there was a bullet lodged in the skull, and this could have always been, at the very beginning, they could have thought it was because of a suicide, but the fact that it was in a trunk, they really didn't think that it was a suicide. Sheriff Lumley spoke directly to John David Morris himself when he decided to fly all the way to Arlington, Texas to interview him in person, and he had tons of questions for him. But John was very vague when it came to details. John David Morris would go on to tell Lumley pretty much what he told Noel, that he bought the footlocker years back but couldn't remember where. He would go on to say that he thinks he bought it in 1973, but it could have been later, and that he thinks that he bought it in either Wyoming, Iowa, Illinois, or even Oklahoma, which that didn't really narrow things down at all. In the Unsolved Mysteries segment, Sheriff Lumley is interviewed, and he makes a lot of sense because he basically says, if you buy this strange old trunk from a garage sale or whatever, you're going to be super curious to open it. You're going to want to find out what is inside of it. It's like opening a present on Christmas morning. So the fact that John just never found a way to open it but kept it all those years, it just looks odd. They did determine that the trunk itself and the lock were most likely from the 1930s, which makes things a little bit stranger. When this bit of information was discovered by Noel, he believed that his good friend, John David Morris, had to be innocent because of how old the trunk and lock were. But when it came to Sheriff Lumley, he believed that John David Morris had to know more about the remains from inside the footlocker. That maybe he wasn't the one responsible for this homicide, but he had to know some more information about it, especially possibly who this man may have been in life. They wanted to find out who did it and how it happened, but they needed to know who this was first, and then everything else after that would kind of start hopefully falling into place. Sheriff Lumley did do a background check on John, and it turns out that he had some run-ins with the law through the years, so that definitely didn't help. On March 31st of the year 1992, the skeletal remains of the man found in the footlocker were sent over to the Wyoming State Crime Lab, and they would end up creating a facial reconstruction of what the murder victim may have looked like while he was alive. It was determined that the man was most likely in his 50s or 60s when his life was taken, that he was Caucasian, and probably around 5 feet 8 inches in height. The footlocker was further examined, and it was said to have most likely been used by someone in the U.S. Armed Services between the First World War and the Second World War, which would have been anywhere between 1914 to 1945. So again, not really narrowing things down too much, but it was getting somewhere. The Hy-Vee grocery bag, though, which comes from a grocery store located in those kind of Midwestern states, was a style of bag that began being manufactured in the early 1950s. The bullet in this unknown man's skull came from a .25 caliber gun, most likely from the turn of the century. The bullet itself was made in 1908. So we're dealing with quite a few different time periods here. Now, one of the strangest aspects of this case, in my opinion, is that the remains were said to have been previously buried, meaning that some individual or individuals buried the man's remains and then unearthed them sometime later. Not only that, but when it came to the skeleton, this man's lower leg bones and one of his hands were completely missing. It wasn't a complete skeleton, which does make sense if the body was buried and then dug up, and the person who dug them up maybe didn't dig up the entire skeleton. A lot was discovered about this case within about a year's time because the remains were discovered in the trunk in 1992. Tons of testing was done that year and questioning of individuals involved. And then the story was eventually aired on Unsolved Mysteries in February of 1993, only a year later. During the short 7 to 8 minutes that they covered this case at the very end of the Unsolved Mysteries episode, they interviewed people directly connected to the case, and one of the people that they questioned and talked to was John David Morris. But of course in the show they called him Gabby, and his identity was completely hidden on camera. He was just like a shadow. But it would turn out that Gabby, I love how I say Gabby, like I'm Gabby, but like Gabby, aka John David Morris, would have a close connection to the murder victim. At the age of 19, a young lady named Shelly Stattler would hear about the discovery of bones in a trunk in Wyoming. Weirdly, Shelley's father told her that the bones might belong to her grandfather. Through the years, Shelley didn't focus too much on the story, but as she got older and dove a little more into her family history, the story fascinated her, and it stuck in her head how her father said that the bones could belong to her biological grandfather. She wanted to find out more. After the airing of the episode on Unsolved Mysteries, and every time they aired the episode on television, the department that handled this case would receive hundreds upon hundreds of tips about the case. And truthfully, none of these tips really went anywhere, and it became very tiring for them, which happens a lot. Shelley and her mother, Kathy, tried to reach out to the department regarding the case, but their calls always became one of the many that the department had to eventually look into. Their efforts didn't really go anywhere for a bit of time because it was hard to really get the department's attention through the flood of calls that they received. Shelley decided to call anywhere she could think of that may take her seriously. She was working her way up through departments and people higher up. Eventually, things worked in her favor. Her main goal was to have the man's DNA compared to her mother's DNA to see if it was a match, because it was believed the man, the unknown murder victim, was said to be her biological grandfather on her mother's side, so her mother's direct father. A DNA test was finally done in the year 2017, and it was a 99% match. The man was Shelley's grandfather, like she believed wholeheartedly for so many years. The skeletal remains of the man in the footlocker belonged to Joseph Junior Mulvaney, a man with a very mysterious death and also a mysterious life, because not much is known about it. We do know he was born on January 3rd of the year 1921 in Mattoon, Illinois, to parents Joseph and Catherine Mulvaney. Most information about Joseph's life was found out by his granddaughter, Shelley, and can be found on his Find a Grave site, which I will link below in the description of this video. When it came to Joseph's life, he was definitely extremely loved by the people around him, and he was especially close to his mother. He came from a long line of soldiers. His father and grandfather both fought in wars, so he truly believed that that was what he was destined to do at some point in his life. He joined the National Guard in 1941 and was honorably discharged in 1945. It is believed that one of the hardest things that he went through during his life is when his mother became very sick and passed away from tuberculosis in June of the same year that he would be honorably discharged. So he was still away when his mother passed away, and this was very hard on him. That same year, he would begin working for the railroad, and he moved to California, and he was still working for the railroad at this time and would be from 1946 to 1960. He would then meet his wife, Mary Alice McLeese, and go on to have 3 children with her, which were Catherine, born in 1954, JJ, born in 1956, and Patrick, born in 1957. In the year 1961, they would go on to move to Des Moines, Iowa, and would make a huge move in life, which was owning a home together, a place to raise their children and have a beautiful life together. Joseph's wife had ties to Des Moines because she was born there and grew up there, but Joseph, he had never been to the area before and moved mostly because that was his wife's hometown. His wife, though, she had a child from a previous relationship as well, a son. This son's name was John David Morris. Yep. Now, when you start researching this case and looking into it online, multiple sources that you come across will tell you that John David Morris was Mary Alice's stepbrother. And multiple sources will tell you that he was her stepson. This was obviously very confusing to me as a researcher. It was pretty much 50-50. I didn't know which information was 100% factual. So I decided to reach out to Shelly Stattler myself, and she did verify that John David Morris was Mary Alice's son. So when you look back at the entire story of, I bought a locked trunk at a garage sale in some random state and kept it for years, even though I didn't know what was inside of it. Now you know that that entire story was allegedly made up. Long after moving to this area and starting new, during the year 1963, Joseph Junior Mulvaney disappears, vanishes from everyone's lives. His children have no idea what happened to their father, his oldest being about 9 years old at the time. It was said that Joseph and his wife Mary had a tumultuous relationship and that it was obvious to their children, but their children never expected that one day that they were just not going to have their father anymore and that he would just be gone. They had no idea, though, that their father didn't just leave, that he had been murdered. But to everyone in the area, Joseph Jr. Mulvaney he was a missing person, but no missing persons report was ever filed for him. According to Des Moines Register, Stattler believes her grandfather was shot and killed in Des Moines, put in a trunk and buried in the backyard of her grandmother's home, where Mulvaney's remains rest until Morris dug them up and took them with him to Wyoming. I don't think my grandparents had a very good marriage, and I know it affected my mom and her siblings growing up, Stattler said. My grandmother wasn't always easy to get along with. When Mary Alice died in 2009, she had been out of touch with her family for almost 10 years, Stattler says. John David Morris would have been about 16 years old when his stepfather was murdered. There are a lot of theories about what actually happened to Joseph Junior Mulvaney and exactly who pulled the trigger. And because nothing has ever went to court, I can't sit here and say for sure this person is guilty or this person is guilty. But the main suspicion, of course, lies on Joseph's wife and his stepson. At one point in the show, he says, quote, "Well, my being a suspect, first off, I wasn't the least bit worried about it. Why? What do I have to worry about? I mean, really. I know I didn't do the guy, I didn't shoot this dude. In fact, I'm not even as old as the gun that shot him." Now, John Lorden here on YouTube did a video about this case, and I usually never watch another creator's video about a case if I'm getting ready to cover it because I do not want to be influenced in any way. But his video was about 10 minutes long, so I was like, okay, he got to the facts with what happened. So I watched it, and he points out in his video the fact that John David Morris said, "I didn't do the guy." And I thought that was really funny because when I watched the episode as well, that's exactly what stuck out to me. He literally says, "I didn't do the guy. I didn't shoot the dude." It's just, I don't know, what? They did determine that Joseph Junior Mulvaney had died due to a gunshot wound to his left eye by a .25 caliber Colt pistol. Based on the shot, it is believed the shot was done by somebody who was right-handed and that it was done at a very close range. There was also some damage done to the ribs of the remains, so they do think another shot was taken as well that simply grazed the rib bones. According to Trib.com, the family would love to know exactly what happened, but law enforcement in the area hasn't been the most helpful, which of course we've heard that so many times before. Due to it happening so long ago, it doesn't seem like it is at the top of their list to fully solve. Shelley, though, she has put in so much time and effort into her grandfather's case, and from everything that I read from her online, it seems like above anything else, she wants her grandfather to be remembered for who he was as a person and how loved he was by his family and friends and people around him, not just the gruesome and eerie mysteries surrounding his death. Which is why in this video, of course, I covered the case itself, but I really wanted to touch on his life in general. After the identification of the remains, it took another 2 years of Shelley fighting to finally get her grandfather's bones so she could give him a proper burial. She would go on to write on findagrave.com, update, Grandpa's remains were released and we had an amazing military service for him March 2019 at Ballard Funeral Home in Cody, Wyoming. One of the most amazing days of my life. So proud to be your granddaughter. At the service in Cody, Sheriff Lumley was there and he said in front of everyone that Shelley should basically be a detective because of the incredible work she did and how she just never gave up, which I'm sure made her very happy to hear from someone so respected in the case. After so many decades in a dirty, rusty old trunk, and then so many more years looked at for this investigation, Joseph Junior Mulvaney was finally reconnected with his family, and Shelley never even got the opportunity to meet her grandfather, but she cared this much for him and still continues to fight for him and tell his story the way that it should be told. Now, when it comes to John David Morris, it is said that he eventually moved to Mississippi and that he reportedly committed suicide. Still to this day, no charges have ever been filed in the murder case of Joseph Junior Mulvaney. So that is the case of Gabby's bones, also known as the murder case of Joseph Junior Mulvaney. This is just one of those cases that while I was reading into it, I honestly did not really even expect the huge twist in it. It almost seems like a movie script. It is a crazy case, it is, but it is very heartbreaking, and I cannot even imagine how it must feel to have not only your grandfather, your loved one, somebody that was taken from your family in such a horrible way, and it turned into this case that went on for years and became almost an entire entity of its own. Not only that, but to have the person responsible for taking this loved one away from your family also be somebody in your family. My heart goes out to Shelley and the rest of her family, and if you're watching this video right now and you made it this far, definitely put a comment down below for them to see, because we are all about that on this channel, just sending people love who definitely need it and are affected by the cases that I cover here on my channel. And with all of that being said, I will see you in the next one, which is going to be the last video for Oldies October, which is going to be posted on the very day of Halloween. So I will see you then.